how can we motivate our children to speak a language? There are always moments when our children need some incentives to speak our language or any language. Let me start with making sure we distinguish between language acquisition and language learning, which are two different things. In German, we call it Spracherwerb und Sprachenlernen. In Dutch, this is Taalverwerving and Talenleren. In Italian, we call it Acquisizione e Apprendimento della Lingua, and in French, Acquisition et Apprentissage d'une langue, just to name a few. Knowing these terms makes it easier to find articles and research about this topic in the respective languages. Now, with language acquisition, we refer to the skills of understanding and speaking. These two skills are acquired naturally, spontaneously, through an unconscious process, and usually the child controls the pace. Language learning, on the other hand, is an intentional process that presupposes teaching, and the teacher usually controls the pace. Now, for an effective language acquisition, our children need a source of natural communication, which means of interaction between two or more persons, non-verbally or verbally or both. Fact is that from day one, children are receptive for any kind of verbal or non-verbal interaction and connection. Let me briefly mention the 5 aspects highlighted in a video from the European Peach Project about this topic, and you can find the link in the description. First, make speaking your language a solid habit. Second, make it fun, maybe learning by play. Third, create a need. Fourth, praise and encourage the child. And the fifth of the point that has to do with language learning. If you decide to teach your child reading and writing, do it in short chunks, depending on the attention span of your children. Now, the need is a very powerful motivation. Like Casey Liu Williams, professor of psychology at the Princeton University and director of the Princeton Baby Lab, mentions in the Peach Guide for Parents how to raise a bilingual child. Here's a quote. Knowing that there is a need for you to speak a language, like communicating with a community, family abroad, or with your parents, is an extremely effective motivation for language learning. Now, at the Baby Lab in Princeton, they study how babies learn and how their ability to learn supports their development. So need and exposure are key ingredients of motivation. What factors then lead to a decrease of motivation? It seems logic that whenever need and exposure change. Let me explain. When changes happen in the family and there is less time to dedicate to the child, less exposure in the target language, and maybe a shift happens in the child's language use. Possible reasons for this can be starting daycare or school, an illness of the child or the family member, a parent who travels and can't provide the necessary input for a while, or the separation of parents, or a move, the arrival of a sibling, and so forth. All these factors can influence the motivation of a child to speak a language. Here are now some general suggestions on how to motivate a child to speak a language based on research and experience. Be enthusiastic about the language yourself. If we are motivated, our children will be motivated too. If we are proud to speak our language, this will reflect on our children too. And this has to do with the so-called language ideology. When we can't motivate our children to speak the minority language at home, so the language that is less prestigious, less important in the community we live, it will be even more difficult to maintain it. And this can lead to language shift or language refusal. I know it firsthand that this can be just a phase in our multilingual journey. But in order not to make this phase last longer or long enough for the child to turn away from our language completely, to refuse it, we have to become active. I'm happy to discuss this in the comments here below, or in one-on-one sessions with me, or at one of my free online meetings on multilingualism. The next tip is avoid showing disappointment when the child is not saying new words yet. We are often eager to hear our children articulate words correctly, produce correct sentences, but we often forget that language acquisition and learning is a long process. We all need to make many mistakes before we get it right. The next tip is play with the words. Let's just not take this whole speaking too seriously. Let's play with the language by doing happy faces, sad faces, singing, acting sleepy or silly. We can take away the pressure that our expectation has on our children, and we can use our imagination. This works not only with young children, it actually is a fun way to show our teenagers that even if the language becomes increasingly more complex, there's always an enjoyable and playful way to foster it. In the toolbox for multilingual families, Ana Elisa Miranda and I share many activities and games that foster language understanding and speaking in 0 to 15-year-olds. The link is in the comments. The next tip is never interrupt a child to correct the speech. It's a bit like don't wake the sleeping child. And let's be honest, who likes to be interrupted and corrected? Nobody. We all feel inadequate when someone rather focuses on our accent, our word choice, instead of the content of what we're saying, right? So why should we constantly correct our children then? It's not motivating. Well, I get it. It is important to correct every now and then, but if so, wait until the child finishes speaking and decide if it's the right moment to repeat the word or sentence correctly. If your child is tired, stressed, sad, or if you are tired, stressed, sad, and maybe in a hurry, it might not be the right moment. So make sure that your child is receptive to hear how the word is supposed to be pronounced or the sentence to be formed. If your child is ready, encourage him or her to explore alternatives. And that's the next point. It's always more effective to allow self-correction. When we say things out loud and notice ourselves that what we're saying is maybe not what and how we intended to say it, self-correcting is much better than hearing it from someone else to tell us that what we said was unclear. The next tip is choose topics that the child is interested in and needs, for example, for school or to speak with friends or relatives. If your child needs help to find the right word, give the help without judging or making comments like, but I said it several times, you should know by now. Yeah. And the next tip varies from culture to culture, and it depends on the communication style. Some of us can't stand silence in a communication. It makes us nervous. We worry and we feel the urge to fill the silence, whereas some others consider silence as part of the conversation. It's even an essential part in some communication styles. When learning or acquiring a language, we sometimes need silence to process what others said, what we said. If we don't get to somehow echo what has been said in our minds, we can feel easily overwhelmed and even misunderstood and misunderstand situations. Furthermore, silence can be a sign that the child is processing the language. I find that motivation and confidence are intertwined, interdependent. The more confident I am, the more motivated I am. Therefore, everything that increases my children's confidence to speak the target language will implicitly motivate them. How can we increase our child's confidence? I think you know your child better than anyone else, and you know what your child would appreciate. But let me share a few general tips about this. When we follow our children's pace in doing things, not only in speaking, but in doing anything, walking, eating, everything, our child will become more confident. When we avoid interrupting our children, they will be more confident in speaking. The same actually applies to anything they do. If I interrupt my child when he's playing the piano to point out a mistake or something that sounds strange, it will stop the flow. Instead, we should memorize the mistakes and incorporate solutions in later conversations or later settings. Say my child said, "Ich suche für den Ball" instead of "Ich suche nach dem Ball." So uses the wrong preposition in German and actually uses the English preposition in a German sentence. I can either model the right sentence or use the verb suchen, to look for, in another context later, so that my child hears how suchen is used correctly. Ich suche nach etwas, nicht für etwas. Create opportunities to use vocabulary and phrases your children already know and build from there. When we do so, we acknowledge what our children are able to do and send them the message, I see you, I hear you, and I appreciate what you're able to do already. And our child will be more prone to explore further options. When we acquire or learn a language, actually anything we learn, we proceed by trial and error, and so do our children. They might use some words even in a correct way, but are we sure they really understand what they are saying? I personally was very impressed when my children learned English in a very short time, but when I asked them questions about some words, some sayings, I noticed that although they were able to say them in a perfect English, they didn't exactly grasp the meaning. So exploring the language and discovering different ways to say things, also using the other languages our children know, can be very efficient in consolidating the vocabulary and their confidence in the target language. Last but not least, keep speaking activities fun, engaging, and not too long. So adjust to your children's attention spans. Now, I have mentioned language ideology earlier. It's a big topic for many, and I would like to say a few words about this here. When our language is not perceived as valuable, prestigious, something to be proud of, we will not be motivated to speak it. We parents are role models for our children, even when they are teenagers. They might be resistant at times, question us about our choices, not only with regards to our languages, but if we are not consistent and reassuring, they will probably not be it either. When it comes to be motivated to speak a minority language, the way others in our community respond to our languages will affect our feelings for our language and culture. If our neighbors, teachers, colleagues consider our culture or language as not important enough or not something to be proud of, we will feel inadequate. It will affect our motivation and self-confidence. And I'm intentionally speaking about us parents, caregivers, teachers, educators, practitioners, because what we experience can be mirrored in our children and the children we work with. This is why I'm an avid defender of any kind of language and culture, and I encourage parents to maintain their homeland cultures and languages, to be proud of them, because they are a natural gift for our children that they can treasure throughout their lives. Even if in the communities they live in or they will live in, these languages are not accepted to the desired extent, at home we are always allowed to have our own rules, don't we? And what we can do in our comfort zone, our home, we can expand it into our community. Ways to do this are, for example, weekend classes, after-school clubs to foster our language and culture. In schools, they can use translanguaging practices to include and welcome all languages and dialects and their cultures. Many primary schools do this already, and I personally wish that more secondary schools would do the same. There is hope. Finally, our children, we constantly go back and forth between two or more worlds, two or more languages, two or more cultures. Let's just combine them and enjoy them all. So let's foster pride and support our children's innate curiosity towards languages, different registers, slang, formal and less formal language, and play with it in all possible situations. If you like this video, please click subscribe and click the bell to be notified every time I publish a new video.